much, Dr. Kaushik. And now we've heard a lot about public health systems and some of the technologies being introduced to strengthen them. But what about the role of the private sector? What role does it play? Both corporations and private foundations have a unique set of attributes that fuel innovation in very different ways. And so to lead a panel on this very topic, I have the pleasure of introducing Buddy Shah, Chief Executive Officer of the Clinton Health Access Initiative. Trained as a physician and development economist, Dr. Shah is an award-winning social entrepreneur, CEO and global health funder who is passionate about making global health efforts as impactful as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Buddy Shah.
I'm extremely excited to be here to discuss what I think are some of the most important issues facing the globe today, and to do so with a group of panelists that I think are the best place to talk about this big question we have. And before I dive into what we want to cover in this panel, I think it's worth setting the stage a little bit. As we all know, climate change is a huge challenge, and until recently has not been identified as a major global health risk. And so it was very welcome news to hear this morning and yesterday that at this COP28 will be the first time that there's a Global Health Day. I think that's huge progress, but certainly there's a lot of work that we need to do in the lead up to make the most of this opportunity at COP28. There are 1 billion people currently at risk from extreme heat. Climate change is driving an increase in vector-borne diseases. And as David Walton just mentioned, extreme weather events directly lead to extreme health events, whether that's from the floods in Pakistan last year or from the current cyclone Freddie happening in Malawi, potentially driving an upsurge in cholera. And so in order to combat these climate-related health events, I think we need to have two things. One is scaling existing solutions that we already know to work, but secondly, and really importantly, having a pipeline of innovation to develop new solutions and then a way to scale those new solutions. And so in this context, we really want to talk about two things with our panel today. The first is, how can we best mobilize the private sector to identify those new solutions? And then secondly, what do we need to do to break down silos between the private sectors and public sector capital to make sure that those new innovations don't fall into the valley of death, but actually get scaled up to those who need them most? And so, as I said, this is a group of experts that I think is best positioned to cover both of these big and important questions ahead of us. To my left, we have Tala Ramahi, who's the director of Reaching the Last Mile, one of the co-organizers of this conference, where she plays a lead role in shaping the strategy around the global health philanthropy as well as disability and inclusion portfolios. Tala was previously the Chief Strategy Officer for the Special Olympics Games in 2019 and continues to serve on the board of the Special Olympics UAE. Next to Tala, we have Uzma Sulaiman, who's the Associate Director at Community Jameel, which is an independent global organization advancing science and learning for communities to thrive. And at Community Jameel, Uzma leads engagement with the public and private sector, galvanizing support and influencing policymakers to make sure that scientific breakthroughs actually get scaled. And finally, we have Fiona Smith-Laittan, who's Vice President of GSK's Global Health Unit, where she coordinates enterprise-wide global health activities in pharmaceuticals and vaccines with a focus on treatment and prevention of infectious diseases in children and adolescents in the lowest income countries. So really fantastic panel and excited to dig in. Tala, let's start with you. Would love to hear a little bit more about what Reaching the Last Mile is doing, and in particular, your role in bringing together a diverse set of stakeholders to really try to identify new climate adaptation solutions and get them scaled.
Thank you, Buddy, and welcome to Abu Dhabi. I know you arrived quite recently. And thank you to the audience. Just to provide some context, Reaching the Last Mile, as you may have heard yesterday, is a portfolio of global health programs funded by the private philanthropy of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, President of the UAE. For over a decade, His Highness has been investing heavily in disease elimination, particularly within last mile communities. For His Highness, this passion has been consistent, and for a very long time, we've been very lucky to have his leadership be catalytic in bringing different types of partners to the table to be serious about global health issues. Every 2 years, His Highness has hosted Reaching the Last Mile Forum in partnership with the Gates Foundation, and this has certainly become one of the preeminent events on the global health agenda and calendar, where we've managed to bring in global health players to talk about disease elimination. I think more so now, as we start having much more serious conversations around the context of climate and health, and centering the health of people around climate conversations, we were very lucky to spearhead and provide catalytic funding for Forecasting Healthy Futures, which brings all of you here. And as you heard from Dr. Kaushik earlier, just before our panel actually, on how this work has really provided catalytic funding to explore innovative tools to address global health issues, and particularly infectious disease programs, and ensuring that we're ahead of the curve in terms of addressing some of these issues through much more innovative tools, including big data and AI. When we were having this conversation with Malaria No More and a few of the other consortium of partners 3 years ago, the climate health space was still a nascent conversation. And for us to be able to bring in over 140 organizations today and yesterday to start thinking about taking more action on this is incredibly important for us. We hope Forecasting Healthy Futures is a platform where we can bring in more players. So, when we were at some point speaking to global health stakeholders, this was incredibly important. But bringing more people to the table is equally important, including the private sector and potentially more commercially driven investors that, as you mentioned, are looking for investable opportunities that still can help achieve the global health goals that we're all trying to work hard to pursue.
Great, thanks, Tala. And speaking of the private sector, Fiona, I'd love to turn to you and to ground this conversation in a real practical example that's happened in the past and that we might learn from in the future. So, as everyone in the room knows, vector-borne diseases are particularly climate sensitive, and we might anticipate a rise in vector-borne diseases as climate change happens. In this context, GSK has really helped to pioneer a new breakthrough malaria vaccine, which I think has implications both for what we need to do to create innovative solutions, but also potential challenges to scaling those to the communities that need it most. And so would love it, Fiona, if you can just tell us a little bit about the backstory of what enabled the malaria vaccine to be developed, and then what learnings you have for us as a global community going forward in terms of the rollout.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Buddy. And I agree. I think the malaria vaccine is a great example of where partnerships has worked. And I think there's also been a lot of learnings where it could have been faster and decision-making could have been better had we done things slightly differently as a group. So yes, I'd love to just spend 5 minutes sharing those with you. Because as we know, if we are going to get ahead of climate change and climate-impacted diseases, the role of innovation and new medicines and vaccines is part of the armamentarium that we need. And I know that Joelle brought that up yesterday from DNDi. Innovation is key. So agree with that and love to share the learnings. So I'll just start with a very quick kind of potted history of how the malaria vaccine was developed by GSK. And it actually, and this is one of the things we need to do better altogether, it's taken 35 years. So it was initially identified in 1987. We then started working, after we did the initial preclinical and clinical work, we started working with broader partners. PATH was one of the first partners to come on board with additional funding from further partners, we did the phase 3 study, so that's the main safety and efficacy study, in 11 sites across Africa between 2009 and 2015. So that was really testing broad-scale efficacy there. The results from that came in, and in 2005, the European Regulating Agency gave it approval. So it kind of, if you like, the results from that study showed that it was effective and well tolerated enough for it to be given the license. And I think what came then is some more delays. So after 2015, then there was an implementation study that was needed in a further 3 African countries. And this was really, I think, in order to test the feasibility of whether it could be launched. The vaccine isn't given at the same time as some of the routine childhood vaccinations. So it was felt that the phase 3 study wasn't enough to really know that it was going to be effectively used. So we're right now working with further partners, Gavi, Global Fund, UNITAID, and Still Path, on a longer-term implementation study in Malawi. I know we have, I guess, Malawi, Ghana, and Kenya. And finally, we are now, this year, rolling it out more broadly in those 3 countries. So if you think about from inception to now, that's quite a long time. And as climate change accelerates the spread of infectious diseases, particularly vector-borne diseases, we're not going to have the luxury as a global health community, I think, to spend that long in bringing new innovation to market. So if it's okay, Buddy, I think there's four learnings that I'd just like to put out here for the group that would be great to discuss that we could do differently. So one of the first challenges that we had was the finding and working with 11 clinical trial sites in Africa. So it took a lot longer to find great clinical trial sites in Africa because they've been underinvested in the past. And in order to even start the studies, there was quite a lot of pre-investment done with partners and others to build capabilities in clinical trial running, in pharmacovigilance, and others. And the kind of sad thing was that of those 11 amazing sites, and by the end, their expertise was phenomenal, absolutely equaling anywhere else in the world, they were then put on hold for 7 years because there wasn't enough of the clinical trials coming through. So there's something about just building local capacity for clinical trials and our joint role in doing that. The same sites now are being used for the follow-up malaria vaccine, which is coming from others, which is great. So it has done a good there. The second is just a plea for increased dialogue and two-way sharing. I know, and possibly historically for some good reason, there's not always been complete trust between private and public sector, but I think in this area in global health, we're really all on the same page. You know, the only one winner is humanity, so we really do want to work together. And I think if there'd been greater dialogue over the course of the studies and then the implementation study, it would have allowed us to plan better. But as it was, we weren't sure when decisions were going to be made. That made it much harder for us to find partners in terms of manufacturing. In the end, in 2019, we brought on Bharat Biotech, Indian-based manufacturing, but without being able to give them any commitments of how worth it was their while getting into it. You know, that was a real challenge. So I think there was a lot that was being done at risk. Third point, just long-term partnerships. I think we were lucky enough to have different funders and partners throughout the development process, but how much greater would it have been to have one from the beginning right up to the end in mind, that it's only actually worthwhile if it's getting into children's arms and preventing malaria. And the final one, which I think is, again, we're all probably on this platform aligned behind, is just building the local capabilities and capacities for an environment which is going to be receptive and be able to actually roll out the vaccine effectively. So that's right down to trained healthcare workers, malaria vaccination programs, alignment, procurement, forecasting and planning. So how do we, all of us, work together to ensure that that's better on the ground? So that's my thought.
That's great. I think some really important learnings for the next wave of innovations. And speaking of the first kind of lesson that you identified for us around building out capacity in different parts of the world to actually run high-quality research and clinical trials, I think is a perfect segue to Uzma and Community Jameel's work, really pioneering the use of randomized controlled trials to answer and some of the most important questions ahead of us. So Uzma, could you tell us a little bit about what Community Jameel does, and in particular, building local scientific expertise to actually run high-quality, rigorous, randomized controlled trials.
Thank you, Buddy. Also, thank you to Malaria No More for casting Healthy Futures, and of course, Reaching the Last Mile for bringing us together today. To give you a bit of background, so as Buddy said, Community Jameel is an international organization that advances science and learning. And we do this by supporting creatives, humanitarians, technologists, but of course scientists to address pressing challenges, one of which is within the climate space. So we set up these centers, which are housed in academic institutions. You heard from Ahmed yesterday from the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which Betty references, conducts randomized control trials. We've also got the Jameel Institute at Imperial College London, led by Professor Neil Ferguson, who some of you may know, and they conduct data modeling for infectious diseases, including malaria. And then most recently, we launched the Jameel Observatory, which is housed in Nairobi. And it looks at conducting research and compiling data to forecast and mitigate the impact of climate on kind of dry lands and pastoral communities in East Africa. And that's led by a wonderful Kenyan scientist, which I'd hoped would be able to join us, Dr. Guyo Roba. So in terms of building and funding more research in the Global South, and we are a Global South institution, but I think our history is one of which we funded, to a large extent, Global North academic institutions. There's some great research over the past few years that shows like 80% of climate financing, it still goes to Global North institutions. And then there was like a list a few years ago of kind of leading climate scientists, and only 5 came from Africa, and again, very few from other regions. And so what we're seeing is this dominance of research coming from the Global North. And so we obviously wanted to change that. So, I mean, we're still going to be funding the MITs and the Imperial College Londons of the world, but we're making a concerted effort over the past few years to either find new opportunities in the Global South or create new opportunities in the Global South as well. And that kind of mentality and mind shift has, led us to the creation of the Jameel Observatory. And it was important that it was housed in the region that it was set to look at, so in Nairobi. And the Jameel Observatory is a compilation effort between us, Save the Children, the University of Edinburgh, the International Livestock and Research Institute. And again, we tried to hire, and we did hire Kenyan scientists through like a very rigorous process. I think, and this is why I wanted Guyo to be here today, the research that he's looking at and the lens that he has is so unique. And this is what we've continued to find when we look at kind of building like capacity or research strengths within the Global South. And there's a variety of like kind of areas that he's looking at. But one of the areas that I think is of particular interest to us at Community Jameel was referenced yesterday by the representative for the Ministry of Health in Malawi, was the integration of kind of traditional science and traditional knowledge. Because I think when you have research that comes from the different areas, you have a variety of different voices and lenses that you can apply. I won't go into like the specific detail, but there's some incredible research that's coming out of one of our labs that's integrating the voices of indigenous communities along the Amazon basin and trying to understand how 9,000 years ago these indigenous communities have been able to create nutrient-rich soil in areas that are normally have nutrient-poor soil because of the climate. And so like the researchers are working with these indigenous communities to understand their practices from 9,000 years ago, and then how that research can then be applied in other communities that are, at risk of increased temperatures. So I think, this is a long-term strategy for us as Community Jameel, and it's a learning opportunity for us as well. Part of that is around increasing capacity. So there's obviously within the research space, there's the short-term breakthroughs that you can have. And I think within climate, especially because of the issues, it's like you go and fund like whatever's gonna like have the biggest breakthrough right now. But capacity building is a long-term goal and something that we're invested in through a variety of different initiatives, which I can go into later. But that's just the kind of intro at the moment.
Great. So to switch gears a little bit, as we think about climate adaptation, obviously there's this first piece of developing the innovative solutions, but we're all here because we want to see those scaled aggressively to get to all the people that need them. So whether that's the existing malaria vaccine or new treatments for other vector-borne diseases like Wolbachia bacteria for dengue, or things in the extreme heat space. A colleague of mine is going to speak after this day, ripping around clean air conditioners, which have the potential, as there's billions of new middle-class consumers across much of the world, to actually both have an impact on climate, but also protect against the health effects of extreme heat. Now, all of these potential solutions, I think, need to have the catalytic agents, but then they also need to get to scale. And in many ways, I think about the three of you as operating on the catalytic side, whether that's Fiona and GSK actually developing breakthrough pharmaceutical solutions, Uzma and team researching new ideas and testing which ones actually work versus don't, and Tala and reaching the last mile, funding and bringing together and convening different actors. And so as folks on the catalytic side of identifying new solutions, what would you like to see from the other players, the public sector institutions and the large private sector players that are going to need to put in the billions of dollars to actually get innovative solutions to scale? What do you need to see at other parts of the finance capital stack to actually make sure that great innovations make their way to the billions of people who need them?
Maybe I can start. So obviously through Forecasting Healthy Futures, we've seeded the malaria prediction and planning tool that Dr. Kaushik talked about, and exploring other innovations that centers the experiences of the community health workers and the communities themselves, because we can only solve for community health challenges if we center community health center community health during these discussions and centering their experiences to be able to arrive at solutions that work for them. I think from our point of view, there's also a lot of hard work that we could be doing, and we're hopefully trying to trigger through catalytic investments such as this to present a commercially viable opportunity to private sector investors. And I think for us, we would love to make the case, and we've been speaking to the World Bank as well, an economic and business case to the private sector investors to see that global health is a real investment that they can make that would achieve the returns that they require from a commercial perspective, but also help us achieve the global health gains that we hope to get. So for us, I think what we try to do is identify these community-led challenges and then solutions, identify the innovations that can address those challenges, whether it's the malaria prediction and planning tool we talked about, bringing technology partners that can think and address this in an innovative way, because ultimately the innovation will always, for the most part, be driven by the private sector. And so having those partners on the table and committed to these causes are incredibly important to us. We've been very lucky to have some of these technology partners on board, including the Weather Company and a few others that have driven the work of Forecasting Healthy Futures and have helped IMAX and Dr. Kaushik and his team achieve what we were hoping to do through Forecasting Healthy Futures. I think there's also a role for academic institutions to play as Uzma mentioned, an incredibly important role in both the research, but also in the innovation. So for example, through the consortium that we assembled, supported and driven by Malaria No More, we were able to bring in a local academic institution, the Mohammed bin Zayed University for Artificial Intelligence, who've also provided the technical expertise required to really scale up and also apply the prediction and planning tool to other potentially diseases, but also make it applicable to other geographies as well. And so that's what we've been trying to do through RLM. We hope to be able to engage more commercially driven investors to see the opportunity in global health. I think there are emerging conversations that we're quite optimistic about, and COP28 saying that health is a real priority for them this year and for the UAE is also an important statement to make, and hopefully will bring in new players to the table.
Great, thanks.
Right?
Shall I pick up on that?
I can go next.
You go next.
Oh, we're going by chair. So I think, like, yeah, you're right, buddy. Like, this scale is always something that the private sector is interested in. I mean, that's, I think, what all of us are interested in. And I think we have a unique role because we have the finances to experiment, to provide that catalytic funding. In the research space specifically, I've found it interesting because, I mean, research for us is like the bedrock to good policy, the good, how actors work, as long as it's based on rigorous scientific evidence. You know that those initiatives can be taken to scale. But there's always this disjointment between the kind of the research and the researchers sitting on one side and what it takes to get to scale, whether that is informing policy or informing, how the public sector acts, development actors act, or even kind of the development banks as well. So one of the areas that we funded 2 years ago was trying to bring policymakers and researchers together through like an embedded lab concept with Jameel Poverty Action Lab. So working through the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development in Egypt, we created the Egypt Impact Lab. And that was where that JPAL would just conduct research and then they would inform policymakers, but then you don't know if the policymakers are going to take it on and bring it to scale. But if you integrated it within the ministry, you have a much higher chance of success. So that was something we launched 2 years ago, and we're now looking to expand that concept within the climate space now, looking at, and Ahmed referenced it yesterday from Jameel Poverty Action Lab and MENA, looking at kind of climate issues and working through the ministries to ensure, again, that scale up and reaching kind of larger segments of the community. And then obviously we're also in discussions with the development banks to see, again, how can they use that rigorous evidence that's coming out of these labs, not just within the ministry, but to take investment decisions within the private sector. If you're trying to move towards a climate resilient city, what are the policy infrastructures that work best to do that? And then how can the private sector be involved? So I think, for us, it's integrating all those different players at the very start of that conversation, not just through financial, but just so that they're at the start of the discussions and the research is leading to something that's important to them to scale up.
Yeah, I love it. I couldn't agree more. So I really like the positioning. I think it makes sense, the private sector as catalysts, because we can do things which are maybe more innovative and more risky, both from our kind of the way that we're financed, but also our expertise. So I think I'd have three things that I think would help with scale up. I think the first is building definitely on the work that Last Mile Health and Jameel Institute does around bringing in community voices, the voices of people affected. I think what would be amazing, and maybe we could use COP28 to do this, would be to have alignment on what the priorities are of the big funders and us. And if we had like 3 to 5 things we were trying to achieve, I think that could galvanize huge action and accelerated action. I think the second thing, which I think would really help scale up, is just continue to have open, transparent conversations, both in terms of how decisions are made in some of these larger organizations, what evidence is required by them, and how we can work really early on to embed that in any programs that we do. So we've kind of always got the end in mind. And then maybe the third point I would make is I think that trying to kind of develop long-term partnerships, or at least end-to-end partnerships where we might be working and sharing the risk, sharing some of the activity that actually starts right at the beginning, but right until it gets into people's hands, I think would also be great. And I think we'd also love that, because then we all kind of learn through the process as well, and then the next time is better.
Yeah, great. And I think, to channel Martin and the Malaria No More team thinking about blended finance really being needed to take big ideas to scale, it's quite encouraging that, we've got the 3 of you here, but then there's also partners in the room from the Global Fund, which is the largest multilateral grant funder of health initiatives, as well as the World Bank, the world's largest concessional debt funder, and the IFC, which has some return-seeking bits of that blended finance capital stack. And so an open invitation to think through what are those big investable ideas and which types of finance are needed to get them to scale. And so maybe the question I'll end with is, as we think about COP28 at the end of the year, there's obviously huge progress in simply having global health on the agenda. But that's obviously not enough, right? We want to have a practical set of solutions that can be championed at COP28 and then taken forward beyond that moment. And so I'd just love to hear how each of you are thinking about the next 9 months from now till COP28, what you would see as success at that convening, and what we should be doing from now until then to make sure that we make the most of that opportunity.
Should I go first?
I think you're the closest integrated.
Okay. We'll do that. Okay, thank you. Obviously, since the UAE is hosting COP this year, there are very big ambitions. Yesterday, you heard from His Excellency Majid Suwaidi. Right after we had a meeting with him where, I quote, he said, this year's COP is not incremental, but transformative. So they have really big ambitions, and for them to say that health is a priority is very promising, but is also a real commitment. So we've been working very closely with the team at COP28 over the last few months, including them being present and convening a multi-stakeholder meeting during COP27 to define what a health day could be and what the priorities should be for the climate and health agenda. You know, the UAE was the first country to sign the Paris Agreement from the region and has really put a serious strategy to achieving net zero by 2050. So as you'll see, the UAE has continued to be a country that wants to think big, and I think for us, we've been challenged to do just that as we think about what we can do for the health agenda at COP28. We do, as you mentioned, want to bring in investable opportunities and cases where we have different types of funders that can commit real and big money to the climate and health nexus. Currently, from what I've read, less than 2% of climate adaptation funding in the last decade has gone to health issues. So we really need to change that, and COP28 presents us with the opportunity to do just that. I think we have the right people in the room to start thinking about what these opportunities could be, what could we be funding, and what could be a pipeline of opportunities that can bring in pre-existing donors, the multilateral institutions, the development banks, but also new investors that can start scaling up these investments and really making transformational change on the global health space. So what I would urge is for people to think big and to come to us. This is, I think, a call to action to all of you to come to us with any big ideas that you think are worth having on the table at COP28.
I think from my perspective, there's been so many successes already just by the location of where the COPs have been last year in Egypt and now this year in the UAE. I think, you know, before there was very little interest, and this was referenced yesterday, about the amount of research that's happening in the Middle East region, which is warming at twice the global average. And over the past 2 years, we've been approached by a multitude of different institutions about what are the breakthroughs for the region, how can we invest in the region? And we didn't hear that 2 years ago. It was about climate mitigation, then it was about adaptation, but it was focused on different regions. And now the Middle East is having its opportunity because this is a global issue, and we need to spread out the financing, and you can find incredible innovation solutions that can be tested, tried here, and then scaled up into other territories. So I think, yeah, it's great what just the location of the COPs has done for investment into this region. And just like Tala was saying, I think we're also, you know, developing, looking at what are those big ideas that can be like, you know, scaled up or announced at COP that can bring the community together. There's a lot of, again, interest in the region. We're, you know, looking at some ideas around infectious diseases, and we've seen there's going to be a rise of malaria in areas that, you know, weren't that it wasn't in before. And so what are those like big things that are going to be happening in the future that we can try and create solutions to now and COP? I'm really excited for how those are going to be addressed in Dubai at the end of the year.
Yeah, I agree, and I think enormous thanks to the UAE Organising Committee for putting health on the agenda for a day for the first time. I think it's just transformative, actually, so that's great. So I think there's probably 3 things that I think it would be good. I think celebrating innovation, celebrating partnerships, and how we make it real with case studies. So I think around innovation, clearly from our perspective, it's around vector-borne infectious diseases, it's around growing resistance accelerating with climate change, and how we maintain a focus on all sorts of solutions, which probably include medicines and vaccines, but more things as well from a community upwards basis around better innovation there. I think the second is partnerships. I think even the malaria vaccine example, it just simply would not have been possible. It absolutely wouldn't have been possible without some of the broad, trusted long-term partnerships, longish-term partnerships that we have had. And I think with people in the room here, PATH, Global Fund, Gates, Unitaid, probably going to forget the more Gavi, incredible. So I do think there's been some tried and tested partnership models in global health, and how can we bring those into climate change and health, because actually it works. And the last is, I think, building on things that both Tala and Uzma were saying, just around case studies, because it's so big that unless you kind of make it real, and this is an example of excellence, and this is what it could look like, then I think people could go away with just feeling a bit overwhelmed by the scale of the problem.
Yeah, great. Excellent thoughts, and I think an optimistic note to end on, which is, after 2 decades in working in global health, I feel like we're often in the space of actually knowing what works, having cost-effective solutions, but then trying to piece together the interest to actually scale it to the people who need it most. And based on what Tala said about the COP organizers putting health on the agenda, there could be a rare opportunity where actually the demand is there, and really what they're looking for are those breakthrough ideas. And so I'm excited for the next few days to brainstorm with all of you in the room around what those solutions can be and how to build momentum from now until the end of the year to make the most of this great opportunity ahead of us. So with that, would like to thank our experts and panelists, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Buddy.
Thank you.